the calm character of Calamity. It really shows when things are difficult, the different approaches that people have to troubles. In fact, we know we each have people in our lives who are good at getting through trouble. We call on them in times of difficulty. We ask them for their help. They are the people who do not panic. They are the people who do not overreact. They are the people who are able to give us advice and to help us through calamities. And we're going to talk about character in a few moments, but I want to emphasize at this point the calm character. What does it mean to be calm? And why is it important to be calm? Last summer, I went to an active shooter seminar put on for churches. It was held in Sigel. And it humored me. One of the first pieces of advice, and really they approached the whole seminar from the aspect that as churches, we're much more likely to experience other kinds of emergencies rather than that one single horrific event. So in times of emergencies, do you know what their number one piece of advice is? Don't scream. Don't add to the chaos. Think about when you've been in a calamity, when an accident's taking place and everything is falling apart. There is no doubt at least 2 or 3 people standing by screaming their silly heads off, right? Making the situation worse, making it more difficult to sort out. I'm stuck on Mac today. I'm not sure why that is. I actually meant Kyle. I'm not even the same physical family. I have lily pads up here, and one time Christian and I were walking around our pond. I think Evie was with us as well. And I saw a bullfrog sitting on the edge of the pond. And I said to Christian, Christian, do you want to see how to catch a bullfrog? He said, yes. So I told him, I said, first off, you step in the water, because when you walk on dry land, they feel those vibrations, and they jump into the water before you get to them. So first off, and as I stepped a little more than ankle deep into the water, I said, you got to get in the water so they don't feel you coming. They don't hear you coming. And so I stepped into the water, and I slowly approached this bullfrog, and when I got to him, I positioned my hand behind him, and I shot it down quickly, and I grabbed him right behind his front legs. And I went to pick this bullfrog up out of the pond, and he was attached to something. And I pulled harder. He does not want to come. And I pulled harder, and now I'm envisioning something very irrational in my mind, but I'm trying to make sense out of this difficult situation. It's almost as if this bullfrog has a hold of the lily pads or the weeds. And so I'm pulling them harder and harder, and I figure this bullfrog is not going to overpower me. If I have to pull him in half, I'm going to get him up out of here. And as I get him up, and I was surprised how incredibly difficult it was. This is why I mentioned your name, Kyle. I look closely, and I have a hold of this bullfrog like this, and right under my fingers are snake jaws. And this 40-foot anaconda at any rate, the snake has a hold of this frog. Now, I don't know who was more surprised to see the other, but I was the only one that screamed. At least Christian would tell you I screamed. I told him afterwards it's not a scream, that's a snake repellent call. So I screamed and leapt out of the water. Well, I'm not sure I wouldn't do, I'm pretty certain I'd do the same thing if I did it over today. But we understand the difference between keeping our calm, looking for the right path in a difficult situation, and simply panicking. And so we started to lay the foundation for this concept last week from Daniel, the first chapter, when we looked at the pertinent P's of predicament. And we talked about the necessity of being prepared for predicaments before they come. We know they're coming. We would be foolish to think that we are not going to face difficulties or predicaments in our lives. So we need to prepare, both physically and spiritually, for the difficulties that are coming ahead of time. We noted that God used Daniel's personality, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego's personality, to get them through the difficult times. We noted that they were in a position of weakness, without any real strength, and so God had them use persuasion to bring about greatness. And we noted that the providence of God had them right where He wanted them, and that He gave them a great position out of that. I say all those things and review those elements, those P's of predicament, because particularly the first three of those five are really getting at the idea of what kind of character are we developing? What kind of character do I have? Now, character can be described in many different ways. In fact, oftentimes we hear it said, it's what we do when no one's looking. It's who we are when we don't think anyone is noticing. Well, Emily asked me when Christian, the computer crashed just before worship started, and he was up here sorting through it, and she says, how did he learn to do that? I said, I don't know. These young kids are born knowing how to do it now. But I use this illustration in default position because we understand if you do anything with computers what default position is or setting. If you use a phone, they come with default settings. That's if you do nothing, what happens every time. Now you can change those default positions. Oftentimes we say to ourselves, well, this is just the way I am. This is how I react to difficult times. This is how I treat my wife. This is how I react to my daughter spilling grape juice all over the carpet. Default positions. But what's interesting about default positions is they can be changed. You remember a few years ago when Tom Hanks landed that Boeing on the Hudson River? Some of the story behind Solly did it first, and then Tom Hanks reenacted it, Connie. She was looking confused. But when Captain Solly landed that on the river, they asked him in an interview, how did you accomplish that? He said, I really didn't think. I just reacted. Well, I'll tell you what, you put me in the cockpit of the 747 and experience the same problems that Captain Solly had, or Tom Hanks, whichever you want to think of, and I'm not going to react the same way as he did. Do you know why he reacted that way? He had trained over and over and over and over again. So that in those situations, he's not saying, what am I going to do? What should I do? He's evaluating the scenario. He's looking for solutions, and muscle memory and habit are taking over. When we think about our character in our default positions, we should think about the constant training that we're putting into ourselves. When I say this is just the way I react to my daughter spilling grape juice on the floor, I should understand that that reaction is training me to react that very exact same the next time. And if I want to react differently in that scenario, then I have to start training myself. Maybe I need a less stressful situation than grape juice on the carpet. Maybe I need to start reacting differently when she leaves the crayons on the floor. And training myself. In Hebrews, the 5th chapter, verse 14, talking about those, the Hebrew writer, before he gets to verse 14, is criticizing the Hebrew Christians. And he says, I have much more to say, but it's hard to explain because you are dull of hearing. He goes on to explain that essentially you have no more maturity than to be able to drink milk. And as he talks about maturity, notice what he says in the 5th chapter in verse 14. He says, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their power of discernment, right? The power of judgment, trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. There's a statement made here that is supporting exactly what I'm saying. That what we do by default is a matter of training. Because as we train ourselves, we are developing habits. And the habits or the character that we are developing will dictate how we act in times of calamity. Think about everything that's going on in the world today. People are reacting in very different ways. One of the primary differences in how each individual reacts is the habits that have been formed. So I ask, what is your autopilot setting? Do I need to reset or adjust my autopilot to build a more stable and impactful life? You see, if I want to have calm character in calamity, I must develop my character in a godly fashion before calamity arrives. Calm character in times of calamity. Number one, we need clarity. Now, these young men had clarity. They needed clarity. And I want to set a little bit of the background a little bit. If we were to read chapter 3, 1 through 7, we would see this scenario built out. Number one, Nebuchadnezzar built a false god, and he's asking everyone in his kingdom to bow down to this false god. And we say, well, that is ridiculous. But I want you to consider some of what's taking place. Number one, and Kevin, you're our engineer, our resident engineer for the morning. This, if we look at the first verse, the first two verses really, this idol that Nebuchadnezzar has built is 10 foot wide at the base and 90 foot tall. Is that an accomplishment from an engineering standpoint? How about the fact that this is hundreds and hundreds of years before the time of Christ? This is a feat. This is something impressive. I believe that what Nebuchadnezzar, more than anything, is asking these people to bow down to is his accomplishments, his greatness. And we see that desire in Nebuchadnezzar's life later. Nebuchadnezzar sets his amazing feat up, and he says, I want everyone to bow down to this. Now, if we read those first 7 verses, we see that the decree comes from Nebuchadnezzar, saying, and all those instruments are laid out. Why every time he says you're going to bow down to this idol, does he talk about all these different instruments? Now, David was hopeful to go to a ZZ Top concert June 30th. Wasn't just David. Now, David, why would you like to go to that concert rather than just listening to a CD? It's a different atmosphere, isn't it? Different setting. I say that because these young men are somewhere between ages 13 and 17 years old. And now everyone they know is bound down to this idol. And now there is all this music being played. We're setting the atmosphere. Emotion is taking over. And the natural instinct of everyone there, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego, would to do precisely not only what they're commanded to do, but what they want to do at that point. Why is the story of these three young men so different? They had clarity. They knew what they believed and why they believed it. That's important because we look at them, we say, boy, they resisted once. In verses 1 through 7. But now they are singled out. And Nebuchadnezzar comes to them, ending with verse 14. He says, now listen, I understand you didn't bow down. I'm pretty certain this is all just a misunderstanding. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back through all this again. We're going to play all the music. We're going to do all this stuff again. And as long as you bow down, it's as though nothing ever happened. In other words, here's your second chance. What pulled these young men through the second temptation? They knew what they believed. And I believe even more importantly, they knew why they believed it. But that all pales in comparison to around verse 19 where Nebuchadnezzar says, listen, if you don't bow down, I'm throwing you into the furnace. And he has the furnace overheated to 7 times its normal temperature. Why did they not cave? Sometimes we are hard-pressed to know what we believe. We even less seldom know why we believe it. Someone questions you on your faith, and you get mad. You start to yell. You start to throw personal insults. You want to know what I believe the number one reason for all that is? You're insecure. You don't really know why you believe what you believe. And so we start to deflect. You see, we can't have calm character in times of calamity unless we not only know what we believe, but we know why we believe it. When Tom Hanks is in that pilot, in that cockpit, he not only knew what he needed to do, he knew why he needed to do it. He knew why he had to land that plane on the Hudson. He knew why he had to react in each way he did. And so he wasn't overcome with the motions of the moment. Secondly, as Kevin started reading for us in verse 16, we see that these young men had an incredible amount of conviction. See, it's one thing to know something. It's one thing to believe something. It's another thing to have conviction. Now, I've had a couple minor surgeries in my life. And I understood and I knew going into the surgery that the anesthesiologist was not there to suffocate me. But you know what? And now I don't think they ever put you under with a gas mask, but my first surgery they did. When that gas mask first comes on, I started to wonder about that. I started to wonder about how capable the doctor was. You see, I intellectually knew all of the qualifications. When I'm in the moment, it's more difficult. These men, unlike me at that point of my couple minor surgeries, had the option of walking away. See, conviction is what it takes to follow through even when the small voices of doubt are rolling in the backs of our mind. Here's what they said. In verse 15, they are asked, who is this God who is able, you think, is able to deliver you from my hands? And their response is, O Nebuchadnezzar, we won't be careful. We have no need to be careful in answering you in this way. They had conviction. Thirdly, they had consistency. Remember Daniel 1 that we looked at last week? These young men, as well as Daniel, are presented with this situation where they are told to eat the king's foods. They are told to neglect everything that God's law said about their dietary habits of that law and to go along with what they're now being taught to do. Now I ask, how important would Daniel 1 be if now in Daniel 3 they're bowing down to this idol? I don't believe we'd be reading about them at all, about how brave they were in Daniel 1. I don't believe we'd be reading about that because we wouldn't be reading about the impact that they had on this nation. We wouldn't be reading about how an ungodly and heathenistic king, Cyrus, paid to rebuild the temple. What if they had refused here to bow down, having eaten the king's food in Daniel 1? How foolish they would have looked. You see, consistency is important. It's always easy to do what's right when there's no pressures to do anything else. But doing what's right when it's easy to do accounts for very little, particularly as it pertains to our influence. In order for their character to impact in times of calamity, these young men needed to be consistent. They needed not only to have clarity, they needed not only to have conviction, but they needed to be able to act on it, chapter in and chapter out, in every instance of their life. Fourthly, in verse 17, we see that they have confidence. I mentioned in verse 15 that Nebuchadnezzar says to these young men, who is this God that's able to deliver you out of my hands? Oh, we look at that and we chuckle and say, well, we know. I know. Let me really get at what Nebuchadnezzar is getting at. Listen, young men, you see that furnace over there? Can you feel the heat off it? It's going to get real hot here in a moment. Can you feel that? Can you see it? Where's this God of yours? Where's this God that allowed your people to be conquered? Where's this God that handed your people into my hands? Where's this God that allowed you to be brought to my palace? Can you feel him? Can you see him? Do you know where he's at? You see, I believe that's what Nebuchadnezzar is really getting at. Who is this God of yours? Well, 16, as we mentioned, they said, we're not going to be careful to answer you, O king. In verse 17, we see their answer. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Now that's confidence. Now, these aren't just words, because these young men aren't bowing down. This is confidence. They knew that the God they served was able to deliver them, even though he had not delivered them from the armies that had them in the position they were in. He is able. They had confidence. But confidence without courage, I believe, is akin to foolishness. Because something interesting about these young men is that they weren't confident that God absolutely would deliver them from that fiery furnace. I think sometimes we can misquote that. We can missee that in Scripture. Notice what they were confident of. He is able. My God is able to deliver us, to deliver me. But notice verse 18. But if not what? If he does not deliver us, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship your golden image that you have set up. That's courage. These young men said, I want you to know, Nebuchadnezzar, that I serve a God that's able to deliver me. But if not, I'm going to burn up serving him. Not live having denounced my faith. Well, why would God not deliver them? I think I told Jeremiah how relevant his topic is. Something as Christians that I think we forget that is illustrated all throughout the Old Testament, although we can read Daniel 3. Most of us have read Daniel 3 and we understand what's about to happen. Furthermore, we know the purpose God has for them. We know that God is influencing this great and yet ungodly nation through them. But you want to know something interesting? I don't think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego understood God's purpose. I don't think they knew what he was going to accomplish from them. In fact, this verse tells us they didn't even know whether they were going to survive the situation. The fact of the matter is, many of their kinship or many of their family did not survive the battles that preceded it. You see, we don't always know God's plan for my life. What I know is he has a plan. What I know is he has a purpose for me to serve. And we as Christians, if we are going to have the kind of character that impacts in times of calamity, that stands out in this dark world, that is different from everyone else around us, we need the kind of courage that these young men had. Why did they have that kind of courage? They understood who was in control. Notice verse 17 again, as we've read it once. They said, our God whom we serve is able. We kind of brought this up last week. This isn't the first pandemic that our God's been through. There have been pandemics, there have been epidemics in China that wiped out half of the population. There have been pandemics that have wiped out a third of the world's population. We kind of look at this like it's never happened before because it's never happened in my life. These things have been here. And they've had real impacts. What's your point? God's been here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego had never been in Babylon before. They'd never been in the palace of a foreign king, under the reign of a foreign king, facing the pressures to bow down before a false god, the heat of the fiery furnace. But God had been. In our world, we'd say it's not his first rodeo. He's been there before. You see, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego had never been there, but they knew that God had. Interesting, Job pleads for 30-some chapters. God, let me make my case. Let me talk to you face to face. God, I just want to talk to you. And at the end of the book of Job, God appears before Job and he says, I won't open my mouth again. God talks to him out of a whirlwind. He says, stand up and fasten your belt like a man. Give an answer for yourself, Job. And we look at those couple chapters where God interacts with Job, and my thought is, man, that's harsh. What God says to Job is harsh. But you know what God was saying to Job more than anything else, I believe? I'm in control here. I had a conversation this past week about Job. Do you think Job could ever imagine, could even get his head wrapped around an inkling of the idea we'd be standing here or sitting in this building today talking about him? Explain PowerPoint to Job. Good luck with that. Oftentimes, if you're over 50, we have trouble with PowerPoint. Sorry, getting an evil eye from down here. If I need it, Russ will come out and back me up on that. Just saying. I'm going to stand over here for a while. He knew who was in control, right? He knew who was in charge. These men had no clout. Isn't this something we're always clamoring for? No one listens to me. No one hears me. One of the things social media has done is it's made us all feel important. The fact of the matter is, in those aspects, none of us are all that important. Our opinions all seem so smart and intelligent and easy to solve all the world's problems to me. Meanwhile, at least half the world, if not 90% of it, looks and says, that person's crazy. And I mean that about your opinions and my opinions alike. We say, well, I can't influence the world because no one listens to me. I tell them how to run their lives. They just don't listen. Here's the problem with telling people how to run their lives. When Mike Smith starts telling you how to run your life, you end up looking at Mike's life. And you say, well, no, hold on. I'm not too impressed. Where do we get our clout? And if we have no clout, does that mean that we have no influence? Verse 15, notice that Nebuchadnezzar is saying, who is this God that you serve? Why would I listen to you? But through their character, their calm character in this time of calamity, look in verses 28 and 29 if you would. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego shall be torn limb from limb. This guy had an issue with violence, didn't he? It's another issue with Nebuchadnezzar. But they'll be torn from limb to limb, and their houses laid in ruins. He's serious, though. He's going after it. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. You see, Nebuchadnezzar went from saying, who is this God, to saying, no one, no other God will be served. by having calm character, godly character. In this time of calamity, they were giving clout. Why? This is what's so hard for each and every one of us. Maybe not you, but for me and for everyone else in here except you, right? We want credit. We want to be seen as wise. We confuse being wise with being seen as being wise. You know what's interesting about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abendnego? They were no more than conduit. And they understood that. Lee, what's conduit? He points. Its only purpose is to take something from one point to another, right? No one looks at a building and says, boy, isn't that conduit pretty? In fact, usually you're covering it up, aren't you, Lee? It's never seen. Notice verse 28, that Nebuchadnezzar does not say, I am so impressed with you three young men. He notes that they served a God, but everything they did pointed to that God. Now, I believe, brethren, for you and I to have an influence on our fellow mankind, for us to have an impact on society, that we will have to let go of ourselves, that we will have to overcome our pride, and to understand that we are no more at best than conduit that takes everything to God. Think about Matthew 5:16. That we would let our light so shine before men that they would see our good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. The idea of conduit is strong. And lastly, as we come up to verses 24 and 25, we see Nebuchadnezzar has them thrown in. The furnace is so hot that the people that throw them into the furnace are actually consumed and die. And he jumps up and he says, hold on, from a safe distance I add. He says, hold on, didn't we throw 3 men bound into the furnace? They say, that's right, king. He says, well, there's 4 up and walking around. And when we understand the kind of company we keep, when we truly keep this kind of company in our lives, we will be able to have calm character, even in times of calamity. If you keep any other company whatsoever, I assure you that none other can save you from the challenges of life. None other can help you to be what you were really meant, designed, and created to be than that of Jesus Christ. If you have a desire to commit your life to His, if you have a spiritual need that you would like prayer and help and addressing, if you're here physically, I encourage you to make that known by coming forward. If you're with us electronically, I encourage you to reach out and to let us help you in any way we can.